Bush pilots. I'm standing above the Back Bay in Yellowknife, the capital of the Northwest Territories of Canada. The Arctic Circle is 450 kilometers to the north, and here is where our adventure begins. It's about 62 degrees above the equator here, and right now it's minus 35 degrees Celsius. Real brass monkey weather. But it was gold, masses of it, that was discovered over there 55 years ago. And that's the reason why Yellowknife became the hub of aviation in the north.
Way up north, the cold wind blows. Take a walk, you freeze your toes, and in the ocean, only icebergs to be seen. In the land of the wireless radio, there's only one way you can go, and the distance to your neighbor is extreme. You need some food or gas or nails, you're lonely, could use some mail. Your leg is broke, you sure could use a nurse. In an otter or a beaver, you'll be happy to receive her. Things may get bad, but without her they'd be worse. She's an ambulance, a zoo, she is everything to you. Though she makes some scary noises and she's never warm and dry. She's a truck and a canoe, she's a postal service too. And on top of everything, she flies.
Our adventure really starts back in the late 1920s, when those early aviators set off to develop the Northwest frontier. They flew on a canvas wing, a missionary's prayer, and a gasoline engine. And they called themselves bush pilots. Today, the aviators who fly up here are still called bush pilots, and the tales they tell are just as tall.
Flying the DC-3 and a Twin Otter side by side. About 10 minutes out of Resolute Bay, and we're all friends flying for the same company. You're on your own, nobody's out there. So I asked JP if he had anybody on board. He said no. So I said, here, I got something to show you. So I stood up in my seat, and I pulled my pants down and stuck my rear end out the window like this. I said, here, how do you like this? And he laughed. He thought that was great, and he took a picture of it. We landed in Resolute Bay 10 minutes later. We walked into the office, and the president of Bell Canada and the president of the Bank of Commerce was standing right there in the office, and they happened to be on board. They thought it was the greatest thing.
If I've flown stiffs, but usually what will happen is they'll, when you go up to a change of altitude in an unpressurized aircraft, they'll give off a lot of body gas, and before they've been embalmed. So they make all burbling noises, like you never know whether they're coming alive or what's going on in there. I never ever had any trouble with them. I never bothered about them. But another pilot I know, they had to put a stiff on him. And they put him right behind the pilot seat. And he was taxiing out. And of course the stiff starts to burble behind him, And he's letting out gases which create moaning. And this pilot's scared to death of stiffs. So all of a sudden he hears this stiff moaning and groaning in the back, shuts off both his engines. He goes completely hysterical, comes right through the top of the escape hatch, and he won't get back in. He's just standing out on top, just screaming. And another pilot went up and took the trip. So we fly everything.
The term bush pilot originated in Canada, and whether you're in the bush or the high Arctic, it takes a few flights for you to realize that today's pilots don't fly just by the seat of their pants. In spite of their bravado, we found bush pilots will do anything to avoid taking risks, unless there's a medical emergency. A typical charter operation is Raycom Air. Situated below the Bush Pilot Memorial here, their runway is either ice or water, depending on the season. Eve Comray runs Raycom with help from her husband Ray, a former bush pilot. Raycom fly a fleet of 4 aircraft, and they fly everyone and everything that needs to get anywhere. There are no roads north of here, so their little airline is the lifeline for a small Indian community 200 kilometers to the northeast. It's called Snare Lake.
It's a small community, probably about 100 people, They have no communication except an HF radio, which some of the people keep in their homes. Some of them don't have a radio at all. We have a base HF radio in this office here that is monitored at least 10 hours a day during the winter time. Roger, Roger, go ahead. Snare Lake, Yellowknife. Okay, I copy that. You've got some children up there that are running a high fever. High fever, is that a Roger on that?
Roger, they have fever.
Roger, Roger. You want me to give the nurse a call in Fort Ray and tell her this, and perhaps she can go out there today?
Roger, please send the nurse.
When it's minus 20 degrees Celsius, no bush flight anywhere takes place without the pilot first performing this ritual. The branches the ski rests on come free. Whack too hard, and it's $10,000 to replace them. This icy plane, the Otter, was manufactured by de Havilland of Canada in 1955. For decades, the Otter has been one of the bush pilot's most trusted workhorses. Today, though, she is rarely used on medevac flights, as twin-engine turbo aircraft need no warm-up time, go faster, and can fly above bad weather.
Okay, so how long is the flight going to be then?
About an hour and 20 minutes or so.
The community of Snare Lake was formed only 20 years ago by a band of Dog Rib Indians who wished to return to their traditional livelihood of hunting, trapping, and fishing. The Dog Rib elders realized that white man's liquor was destroying their society, so the breakaway group banned alcohol from the new settlement. But they didn't ban bush planes. This runway that they land on is the frozen lake, though to anyone but a bush pilot, the land and lake look pretty much the same. The ice on the lake is 7 feet thick.
Look, can I jump?
Oh, you can tell.
Jacques the bush pilot becomes Jacques the flight attendant. Then he becomes a porter, having to carry the stretcher and the medevac kit. But even then, his job is not over. Because it's minus 30 degrees out here, the engine has to be kept warm to stop the oil turning into a thick jelly. In midwinter, even with this engine cover, the plane can only sit for 30 minutes. If the pilot hopes to start it again without lighting a stove under the engine, a 2-hour procedure.
What's that? I'm going to sit in here. Don't worry about me. I do that all the time.
The community of Snare Lake is almost self-sufficient. In the winter, the Indians eat mainly caribou meat, and they make coats and boots, which they call mucklucks, from the skins. The community's radio operator, Madeline, leads our nurse, Wendy, along with Jacques, to the sick children.
Need to get under the shirt there. You get a little cold, but that's all. Just like that.
She's been having a fever 2 days now.
Sounds like she's got an infection in the chest there a little bit. You can hear noises in the chest and the temperature going along with it. At this point, I don't think we should take her back. And if you can, if you think you can continue to manage with the Tylenol and just sort of watching her, and unless things get worse, give us a call back. Okay? Thanks, Ellen.
Bye, Nella.
Bye-bye.
Medevacs are an essential part of bush flying, and emergencies always seem to arise when the weather is worsening and it's getting dark.
I was in Yellowknife, and it was late November in 1962 when we got this call for medical help.
And I had a trip to Snowdrift with the The Superintendent of Indian Affairs, Ken Kerr, he was superintendent of all the Northwest Territories. I also had with me the district health nurse, Ann Pask, and an Indian lady, Mrs. Nita, and her 9-month-old baby, Marianne.
It was very bad weather. Freeze-up was not completed.
There was still open water on the big lake, and of course a lot of fog, and the ice wasn't too good in places. However, we departed for Snowdrift.
It was scary in that you couldn't see where you were.
And the fog was very, very thick, and then it started to snow, and it started to snow quite heavily.
Mike decided, well, he knew we had to come into land. We couldn't fly in that.
I was flying a courier, a Helio courier, with hydraulic wheel skis, and I put the skis down and landed on the ice.
After we landed, Mike got out with his axe to check the thickness of the ice, and Ken got out too.
There was only about an inch of snow on the ice, but I had 9 inches of blue ice and still no water, so ice was the last thing on my mind.
We stayed in the plane, and they found there were tracks on the ice, a man and the boys, and they turned around and came back. So they knew there must be habitation somewhere near.
So we went back to the airplane, and I said, well, no use walking. I know where the camp is now. We'll taxi. So I fired up the airplane, and we started taxiing along between the islands. We were traveling along at about 25 miles an hour and doing just fine, and suddenly Ken hollered, black ice, and crash, through we went, and water came right over the top, and the airplane very abruptly stopped and started sinking.
Mike shouted, bail out, bail out.
I was out the door like a shot. I was very familiar with the door, and Ken was right out behind me, out my door. The wings were already down almost to the ice.
So we were caught in the sinking nose of the plane. Well, the door was on the right on this plane. It was the only door on the back seat. And it was down. It was well underwater.
I tried to kick in the window, and I only had moccasins on, of course, mucklucks. The axe that I had used to check the ice, of course, was in the airplane under the back seat. I couldn't kick it in, and I, at that time, broke my foot, but I didn't realize it.
As the child got immersed in that icy water, it yelled. It yelled. She yelled for quite a while.
Finally, I ran to shore, and I got a big pole, and I rammed it through the back windows to hold the airplane from sinking any further in the ice.
I almost had to spit the water out of, well, I did spit the water out of my mouth. It was coming up over my chin, I suppose, up to my chin, side of my cheek.
And then I broke through the ice. I fell through right up to my armpits, and Ken pulled me out. And by this time, the airplane had settled down so that the wings were touching the ice.
I knew it was resting on the wings, but I also knew it was sinking slowly, yeah. I could see the stitches on the lining of the fuselage, and it was going up stitch by stitch.
Well, about this time, I happened to look up on the great cliffs rise right out of the water there, and quite a ways up this big shore was an Indian. So I started screaming at him in dog rib. I didn't know if he knew the situation or not. And he nonchalantly walked down onto the ice, and he walked up to me, and he said, what's the problem? In perfect English. And so that was Joe Deserly. So I said, Joe, we need an axe. We got to have an axe. And he said, oh, my partner's coming and with the dogs, and he's bringing an axe. I said, how do you know that? How do you know he's coming? How do you know he has an axe? Oh, he said, I know. Well, I didn't believe that. So I said, how far is the camp? And he said, oh, about a mile. So I took off running, and I ran as hard as I could to this camp. And just then, here came Joe Fat, down off the island onto the ice with the dogs. I dived face first into the sleigh, and I said, go as fast as you can, and away we went.
When the baby stopped crying, I guess I had a kind of a sense of aloneness. I thought of things I hadn't done, people I'd like to have communicated with, things I hadn't said.
So we got back to the airplane, and Joe Deserly grabbed the axe, and by the time I got myself out of the carryall, he had knocked all the antennas off, and he was starting through the roof.
And I was afraid that they were going to hit me in the head, and then I'd have a mess of a scalp wound.
I said, stop, stop. Their heads are right there. Be very careful. So we cut it all along and opened it up like a sardine can, and I could see their heads immediately. Well, I pulled the baby out. The baby was first, and the baby was rolling, and the baby was foaming and at the mouth, and it was blue. I thought it was dead. So I threw the baby, and it went tumbling over against the shore, and then I pulled Ann Pask out.
He pulled me past a fret in the fuselage that required him to put my head the rest of the way under the water. And you know, one of the things I thought of, there goes the last of my coiffure. I would look like a drowned rat. So he dragged me out. And I remember thinking, oh, this must be the way that a baby being born by cesarean section must feel like.
I laid her on top of the wing. She was unconscious. I thought she was dead. And then I pulled the Indian lady out, and she was also unconscious for a few minutes. And then we couldn't get Ann off the wing. Her parka had frozen to the wing. We had to take that axe and cut her off the wing. So we put them into the carryall. We threw the baby in on top of them. I took my parka off. It was all frozen. I could hardly get it off. And I threw that over them, and I said, go, as fast as you can. Go to the cabin.
My next awareness was when I had this sense of 1,000 devils needling at my body and extremity.
So there we were in a little cabin about 12 by 16, and there were a dozen of us, counting the Indian family, and they were out of food.
There were no beds. There was this one bed frame, as I remember, in the corner. We were on the floor.
Mike Thomas and Ken Kerr salvaged the emergency ration kit, but it only had some biscuit mix and milkshake powder in it. The fishing net was torn and useless, but at least they were warm. By the evening of the third day, the blizzard had stopped, and hoping that rescue planes would be able to start their search, they marked out a safe area to land on the frozen lake.
And on the fourth day, we heard an airplane coming, and it sounded like a Cessna, and it sounded like a bee going from flower to flower. And I said, now, when he gets to those hills, he's going to have to turn because the weather is too low. He's going to have to come back. So light up the fire. So we lit up the fire, and the smoke was pouring up into the cloud. And so I could hear him turning, and he headed back, and he's getting closer and closer. And it looks like I pulled out the pistol, and I didn't know it was going to go off or not. And as he came over the trees, just before he broke over the trees, I fired at it, and this great red flare went up and just missed his wing, just right past his wing, and he wobbled all around and finally he said to me later, if you ever do that to me again, I'll leave you out there.
We all went running down to the ice, and sure enough, he landed.
Rescue at last, and apart from Ann Pass's frostbite and Mike Thomas's broken foot, the only other damage was to Mike's pride. Today, Mike is still flying, and he fits to a T one definition of a good bush pilot, one who's still alive. Another is bush pilot Martin Hartwell. He's been flying in the north for 20 years, and he's lived through 2 crashes. This one near Fort Norman on the Mackenzie River, he walked out from during the winter of 1987. He wasn't so lucky back in 1972, when he was flying a twin-engine aircraft that some bush pilots called the Widowmaker. Its real name is a Beechcraft 18, and on November the 8th, 1972, after a long day of flying in lousy weather, he headed for Cambridge Bay on the Arctic Ocean. There, he was asked to fly Judith Hill, an English nurse from Spence Bay, over to Yellowknife, along with her 2 Inuit patients, a 15-year-old boy thought to have appendicitis, and his aunt, who was expecting a breech birth. Martin was reluctant to take the Mercy flight, as he had already been flying all day, but he gave in to the doctor's appeal.
Well, I said, if it is so urgent, then, well, we'll try to save somebody else's life. And we took off.
At first, everything went well.
And as soon as I hit the mainland, I also hit this wall of ice fog. And I was in clouds.
Because it was an emergency flight, Martin decided he'd press on using his instruments. even though he was not licensed for night flying. Although it was dark, the weather cleared up as the Beechcraft passed the Arctic Circle, but Martin was unable to tune into a direction-finding beacon on his flight path.
I didn't have any guidance anymore by beacons or so. I was off course.
Instead of heading south to Yellowknife, he was now heading west towards Wrigley.
And while I was looking at the map, the plane had also lost a little of the altitude I wanted to stay at. Took the trees and cartwheeled in.
He'd hit the only range of hills in the region. He was 200 miles off course.
The moment I didn't know, where am I? In bed and dream, had a bad dream or what? You know? Then I realized I was in an airplane. What airplane? Beechcraft. Below my knees, between my legs, lower legs, and under the dashboard, there was a body. It was the nurse's body. She was making such noises. I thought maybe the throat is cut or something. You know, she was dying.
Both Martin's ankles were broken. One knee was fractured.
So I crawled out on my knees. That worked. Pain, I didn't feel any pain. And while the boy put his arm down, and I noticed that the breathing of the nurse had stopped.
Martin directed the Eskimo boy, David Kutuk, to wrap his aunt in a sleeping bag and lay her on the stretcher from the plane.
And they were talking in Eskimo to each other for a while. And, but then he came back, and then the aunt moaned again, so I said, why don't you go back? Sit down by her, and she will be in pain. Yeah, and then he went, and then after a while he said, I guess she's dead now too. Yeah. She died there.
With both women now dead, Martin and David crawled into Arctic sleeping bags and spent a fitful night. It was minus 30 degrees Celsius. Unknown to Martin, the Beechcraft's emergency locator radio transmitter failed to transmit its SOS signal. So when the medevac failed to arrive at Yellowknife, a search and rescue operation was launched that turned into the largest in Canadian aviation history. 7 military aircraft, plus numerous bush planes, combed an area 1,000 miles long and 70 miles wide. But Martin Hartwell was 150 miles outside the search corridor. After 16 days in a makeshift tent, their meager rations had run out, and the traps that the Eskimo boy David had set remained empty. They were facing certain death.
I made a suggestion. I said, the only thing we can possibly survive a little longer, you know, that's if we eat human flesh. And he said, no, I'm not going to eat. Why? He was thinking of his aunt. My aunt was always good to me. I will not eat anything of my aunt. So, what about the nurse? No, he said. Everybody in Spenceby liked the nurse. I liked her too. No, I'm not doing that. Then, if I would give it to you, would you eat it? You know, I'm not taking anything from your aunt, but from the nurse. And he said, shut up, I'm going to die now. That were his very words.
David Kutuk died of starvation on the 22nd night. Martin wrote in his diary, I have 2 days left to live.
sitting here doing nothing is like condemning myself to death, you know. I'll die. Well, the decision was not easy to be made. And then try to help yourself of a piece of a human body, you know, that is something else. But then then I did it, you know. I helped myself.
9 days later, 33 days after the crash, Martin Hartwell was rescued by 2 search and rescue paramedics, followed by a helicopter.
And now came the crew from the helicopter. There was a guy, when he saw that, he was just horrified, you know, stricken, horror-stricken. He saw a body without legs, you know, and some bones without flesh on.
The crew from the helicopter leaked the true story to the press. Martin had to reply.
There was no way out but to eat human flesh. And this I did. It distresses me and probably others to talk more about this. But I do want to stress that it was only I who did this, and that only after David Kutuk's death.
The investigation into the accident was critical of both Martin and the company he worked for. When he'd recovered, he was subjected to psychiatric testing and was ostracized. No one would hire him until he received a letter from this Indian community, Fort Norman, which is on the Mackenzie River. Martin recently celebrated his 10th year at Fort Norman, where he and his wife, novelist Susan Haley, operate an aerial taxi service to Norman Wells. In the summer of 1928, Clennell Haggerston Dickens, known to his friends simply as Punch Dickens, made the first flight into one of the most inhospitable places on Earth, the uncharted and desolate barren lands of Canada's Northwest Territories. Not for nothing are they called the Barrens. There are no trees, no mountains, nothing. 29-year-old Punch Dickens set out in this single-engined Fokker Universal on a 4,000-mile reconnaissance flight. The most dangerous part of the trip was west of Baker Lake, where the map went blank.
There was the word unexplored, and it only had a blank piece of paper there, plus a little bit of dotted in lines to the west.
On the 3rd of September 1928, Punch, along with his engineer, Bill Naden, newspaper editor Richard Pierce, and a mining company president, Colonel McAlpine, took off into the unknown. Their flight across the Barrens to Stony Rapids was 500 miles, and Pierce filmed the entire journey.
It would be right on the limit of our fuel. We had about 5 hours fuel in the airplane, cruising at 95 miles an hour.
His only navigational instruments were a magnetic compass, an altimeter, and an airspeed indicator.
We had been flying over the piece of the map that was marked unexplored. And I jokingly said to the colonel, I said, now you fellas keep looking out the window, and when you see any of those letters down there, you tell me. Then I'll know where we are. The Barrens were beautiful in the morning sunlight, though, and they had a stark beauty of their own. After 3 hours and something, we began to get into haze, and the visibility diminished, and I decided that we'd better take a break.
Although the map didn't mark the lake Punch landed on, he knew they'd been flying southwest. They pumped reserve fuel into the tanks and headed off again in the same direction, hoping to hit Lake Athabasca, which stretched for over 200 kilometers in an east-west direction.
Sure enough, in an hour and 5 minutes, I had hit the shore of Lake Athabasca and turned east and found Stony Rapids.
Stony Rapids consisted of one building, a pet wolf, and the RCMP officer, plus a band of Indians. They rested there for 2 days and then set off to Fort Smith. With 40 miles to go, the engine quit.
My immediate feelings were, well, this is it.
Punch glided down onto the Slave River, and they paddled the plane to the shoreline. Then, out of nowhere, they heard a noise.
Sort of a chuff, chuff, chuff sound, and around the bend in the river came a steamboat. And I don't know who was more surprised, the captain of the boat or ourselves, but anyway, he tooted the whistle, and we waved, and he came and pushed the nose of this barge up against the bank about 20 yards away. He said, "Are you fellas in trouble?" And I said, "Well, not exactly, but would you have any airplane gasoline on that barge?" And he said, "Yes, I've got 10 barrels for some fellow named Dickens who thinks he's going to fly in here next winter."
They had a cup of tea with the boat's captain and headed off to Fort Smith. Then they turned south to make the long flight back to Winnipeg. Punch had flown almost 4,000 miles through the subarctic of Canada. It took them 40 hours over 12 days, and Colonel McAlpine was impressed. Without a plane, it would have taken him a year and a half to make the same trip, using schooners, canoes, and dog teams.
And that would have cost him twice as much. So, of course, he was a convert, and we raised our rates the very next day.
Punch and Colonel McAlpine had proved that you could now use aeroplanes to explore for minerals. But Punch now turned his efforts towards a new challenge, pioneering commercial aviation into the far north. In January 1929, he was given a new plane, a mechanic, and a booking agent, and was asked by Western Canada Airways to see if he could start a regular air service to the small communities along the Mackenzie River. By the summer of 1929, Punch had got as far north as the Eskimo community of Iklavik, located on the vast delta of the Mackenzie River where it reaches the Arctic Ocean. The Eskimos had never seen a plane before.
Some of them wanted to go for a ride, so I took them up. And I was surprised they could not find their way, or they didn't know where they were, because it's the first time they'd ever seen that vast delta of the river from the air. They shrieked and yelled, and they were happy as clams. And they got down, and then there were 6 more waiting.
Commercial aviation had arrived, and it was to bring the North into the 20th century. For the first time, these far-flung outposts got eggs, fresh fruit, mail more than twice a year, and newspapers that were 2 days old, not 6 months.
I thought I had been doing some pioneering. But I also knew at that very moment that my easy trip of 2 days from Edmonton, stopping at every post, was going to make a vast difference in the lives of the people who lived and worked in that great Northland.
The great Northlands of the Yukon and the Northwest Territories cover some 1,300,000 square miles. They are the size of all of Europe, and with the discovery of minerals like copper, gold, and uranium, bush pilots were suddenly seen all over the north. They flew in prospectors, miners plus their equipment, Mounties and missionaries, along with trappers and their bundles of fur. In order to fly year-round, tough yet simple planes were designed specifically for the northern bush, and the aeroplane became an integral part of the history of the North. This plane, the Norseman, was the first. Made of wood and canvas, you froze in the winter, and you roasted in the summer. After the war came the tough all-metal Beaver, which could take off from the smallest of lakes. It became a symbol of an emerging Northland. It was soon followed by the Otter, and finally in 1960 by the Twin Otter, with 2 turbo engines that needed no warm-up time and with propellers that could go in reverse, a godsend when docking on a fast-flowing river. By the time World War II started, there were mines and communities in the most inaccessible of areas that relied entirely on air transportation for their survival. In the north today, the silk scarf devil-may-care brigade of the 40s and 50s is a disappearing breed. But although the planes have improved, in areas like this, they still have to fly by the seat of their pants. What can still kill, however, is the weather, or a combination of bad weather and a pilot who is not familiar with the area he's flying over. There is still no radar at any airport in the Northwest Territories. But the technology of the planes improved, as did their communications.
Echo Alpha Golf Ground taxiing.
Better maps, very high-frequency radios, and direction-finding beacons were built. The pilots would start to fly by their instruments rather than by visual flight rules, taking off into weather that a few years earlier would have grounded the plane. Today, there are very few fatalities due to mechanical failures. But although the planes now have electronics that make them easier to fly, the job a bush pilot does has not changed. Flying the plane remains only half the job. These aerial truck drivers load and unload everything from equipment for mining camps to dog teams for trappers and tourists.
I don't like flying dogs because they stink, a lot, You know, they're outside all the time. And you get a few fights, you get a few bites. When you go up to altitude, they get gas too. And if you've got 20 dogs in there, it gets pretty thick and high. Plus they're puking and everything else.
These aren't bad, but some of the other ones are pretty raunchy. Yeah!
You know, I've pretty near turned green in that front there, because the air circulates right into the cockpit. And, you know, you're sitting there flying with the window open, going boom, boom, all steadily. It's not my idea of an entertaining trip at all.
One has to experience the cold up here to understand why bush pilots seem to spend half their life doing nothing but flying heating oil and gasoline, especially the further north one goes, as there are no trees for fuel in the very far north. Even below the tree line, camps such as this one, 200 kilometers north of Yellowknife, rely on the bush planes for everything, from the skidoos they get around with, to the drilling shed, to the diamond drill itself. The round-the-clock shift workers demand enormous quantities of food, 3 times a day. Fresh vegetables, sausages, 3-inch steaks are always on the menu. Everything is brought in by the bush plane. Their supply of water comes from under the frozen lake, and we found showers and hot water that's heated by propane. Every tent had electrical outlets, and a generator supplies the power for the computer and a radio in the office tent.
No further traffic, sunrise clear.
If there's one job all bush pilots hate, it's hauling fish. It's smelly, slippery, and the ice-packed cartons are heavy to lift inside the cramped cabin. Sometimes the fish are not packed in boxes, which can be messy when you hit severe turbulence. The term of flying fish can take on a new meaning, but it does have a brighter side, fish pilot Dean Carter told us.
One nice thing about hauling fish is they never talk back. They never get drunk on you in the back of the plane. And in all my years of flying fish, I've never had one fish ever complain.
These caribou don't complain either. Flying next Sunday's joint for the Indians and Eskimos often becomes a race.
Look at that. I can't take that back to the guy. There's nothing left.
If the pilot can't get to the carcasses quickly, the wolves will beat him to it. At least in winter, there's no refrigeration needed in the plane. The pilot just flies without his heaters on. But it's not all drudgery. When the sun shines on scenery like this, your spirit soars. This is near Pangnatang on Baffin Island. We're crossing the Arctic Circle. Below us is the Ayuatuk National Park. The glaciers have been here from the last ice age. "3,000 kilometers to the west, near the Yukon, is the Nahanni National Park, a UNESCO World Heritage Site, accessible to tourists only by canoe or bushplane. The Virginia Falls are twice the height of Niagara Falls. And this is on the way to the ultimate tourist destination, the North Pole itself. For your $10,000, you get a long, long, cold flight.
It's rough, it's unforgiving, and it's a desolate place. It's an uncomfortable trip. There's 7 drums of fuel in the back. It's, people are squashed in. It's not a very comfortable trip at all.
We're there, 90 degrees, the North Pole, at last. Less than 400 people have ever been here, and it's still a real thrill when you step down onto the top of the world.
They drink their bottle of cognac or champagne, they take a few pictures, everybody gets back in the airplane, and you fly for 5 hours back to your next destination, which is Eureka.
It's not always so simple. Back in 1982, legendary bush pilot Rocky Parsons was flying one of the first groups of tourists to the pole. Now, the North Pole is actually an ice cap on the Arctic Ocean, not solid ground. Rocky landed on what he thought was thick, old ice. But as the passengers were taking photos and congratulating him, he realized that the Twin Otter was slowly sinking through the new rubbery ice. He rushed back to the cockpit and radioed for help. Luckily, the weather stayed clear and warm, relatively speaking, as it took 6 hours for the backup plane to rescue them. By that time, Rocky's plane looked like this. Today, it still sits in perfect condition somewhere under the North Pole. Rocky didn't want to tell us the story, and because he's named after the boxer, we backed off.
Hello, John. I brought you a pair of snowshoes, John, you can use. Okay, yeah. They'll come in real handy, yeah.
Prospector John Doucette could have stepped right out of a Klondike archive film. When we met him, he hadn't washed or changed his clothes for 2 months. Bush pilot Carl Clouter checks up on him twice a month.
Oh, no, I have a good feeling about this place. If there's nothing in around here, or these here 3 claims that you have done, I think I'd be bloody surprised. That's where the reaction's good, man. The rock is alive. It's alive. Oh, George,
John Doucette has been a prospector all his life, and to this day he works with no field radio or even an insulated tent. He sleeps on spruce boughs and traps most of his food. His only human visitor is aviator Carl Clouter.
We could use this kettle here, I guess, eh?
Well, I get water here.
Okay,
It's still, it hasn't frozen, so...
Okay, go ahead.
If there's any mineral in the area, I'll pretty well find it. It's hard to explain the whole thing about luck. I don't believe in luck. I have evolved with the wilderness, and it's strange how, it seems almost funny how a guy has to keep saying, but it's the crust of the earth is, it's a study beyond belief. If a man knows it and stays with it, she'll pay you back.
She did. The rock samples that John Doucette had collected were flown back to Yellowknife by Carl Clouter and assayed. They contained gold, and diamond drilling is planned for next year.
We'll be landing at the north end of Hazard Inlet, which is about 12 to 15 miles north of Fort Ross and about 195 miles north of Spence Bay.
Willie Lazarich is a folk hero in the north. Based in Cambridge Bay, 250 kilometers above the Arctic Circle, he was at one time the only link for many of the communities in the Central Arctic. For 30 years, he's flown in conditions few men would ever attempt. He's logged over 3,000 medevacs. He's had 6 babies born on his flights, and he's been involved in over 100 search and rescue missions. Today, he's been chartered to look for some whale bones on Somerset Island.
And we check for the amount of whale bones available for a carver, for an artist out of Joe Haven.
Ahead of us is Somerset Island. We're 600 kilometers north of the Arctic Circle, near Bellot Strait, the northernmost point of mainland North America. Below us is Fort Ross, an abandoned Hudson Bay Company post. Because we're so very close to the magnetic North Pole, the plane's compass is useless. Willie spots the whale bones from the air and prepares to land. Landing on the tundra is always risky, and help is never near.
They're sharp rocks, they can rip your tire right off. The cracks can take your undercarriage off, and you may even throw a couple of rocks into your prop and tear one of your blades in half. Now that's different, eh?
What is that, Willie?
It's a vertebra of a bowhead whale. And we have several others here. Okay, that's the head of a very small bowhead. I will make a beautiful sculpture. Here's another head, but that weighs about 300 pounds.
How did these whales get here?
Well, if you look in the bay, this is known as Hazard Inlet. When the tide is low, it's almost a perfect reef, a shallow spot, and we believe they drove the whales in at high tide, and somehow they killed them, and they ate what they could, and used the rest for building houses or dwellings. As you, those are the remains of some dwellings. There are a whole bunch of them over there. There must be at least about 400 or 500, or maybe even 1,000 all along the coast here.
5,000 years later, the Inuit are still hunting whales in this area, and Willie has been chartered by the locals of Spence Bay to haul out the hundreds of pounds of whale meat, called muktuk, back to their community. There is a strict annual quota on the number of whales that the Inuit can cull, and on this occasion, they got their full quota of 28 whales.
Skin de baleen. It's skin of a white whale is a delicacy for the Inuits. And I guess they're paying anywhere between $3 to $5 a pound for it.
The glamour part of bush flying.
You couldn't get me to eat it, I tell you.
With the Twin Otter crammed full with hundreds of pounds of whale meat and a film crew plus their equipment, Willie Lazarich was concerned about the takeoff. De Havilland, who manufacture the plane, say a fully loaded Twin Otter can take off in 800 feet on a proper runway. All we have is a rocky beach that is under the minimum length. With no headwind to help us, there is just no room for error at all. The runway ends in the freezing Arctic Ocean. Because the beach slopes slightly towards the water, Willie decides to take off downhill, so he taxis back as far as he can before turning round. Willie Lazarich made it, again. It really has changed up here since Punch Dickens started flying. Gravel runways have now been built in even the remotest communities, and a scheduled service is available at least twice a week. Airliners like this First Air Hawker Siddeley, landing at Pangnatang on Baffin Island, carry passengers and tons of cargo, and we could be witnessing the end of the bush pilot era. Here in Pelly Bay, 250 kilometers above the Arctic Circle, and not accessible by land or sea, the scheduled service has meant that instead of an annual airlift, they can now get supplies 3 times a week. And for the local Inuit, prices are a quarter of what they were when their food was brought in by chartered plane. The impact of aviation is everywhere, no matter where you look. This DC-8 fuselage now stores Arctic char, aviation with a northern twist.
I've done some of the scheduled stuff down south. I've gone to work with the epaulets, you know, and the white shirt and the tie.
Wilco Dak shoes and a permapress suit and a permapress smile on your face. You can't be your own person.
Here, you've got such a vast territory. You're going to a different spot every day, every tour. It's someplace new, someplace you haven't been to in a while.
And it was fun. But then this hobby became my vocational profession. And then it was hard work, you know.
It's the thing I like doing best. I don't think I have a job. I've got something to do daily that I like to do, and I get paid for it.
They still are the last contact in the chain of transportation where landing fields can't be built or made, and they're doing a wonderful job.
I've always maintained that there are 3 things that kill young pilots. That's weather, weather, and weather.
When there's a crash in the north and the pilot dies, it's like a death in the family. You might never have met the man. You might never have even heard his name. But the whole north feels that loss, because the bush pilot is the lifeline of the north.
Way up north, the cold wind blows. Take a walk, you freeze your toes, and in the ocean, only icebergs to be seen. In the land of the wireless radio, there's only one way you can go when the distance to your neighbor is extreme. You need some food or gas or nails, you're lonely, could use some mail. Your leg is broke, you sure could use a nurse. In an otter or a beaver, you'll be happy to receive her. Things may get bad, but without her, they'd be worse.
She's an ambulance, a zoo, she is everything to you. Though she makes some scary noises and she's never warm and dry. She's a truck and a canoe, she's a postal service too.
And on top of everything, she flies.